In our next session, we'll be addressing the broad themes of religious freedom, law, and society. While religious freedom is a hallmark of democracy, religious institutions can put tremendous pressures on social cohesion and integration when their teachings come into conflict with the law. Religious fundamentalism and extremism threaten the very freedoms we cherish, including freedom of belief, which is why tackling extremism has become one of the burning issues of the day. To begin this session, I would like to introduce Dr. Joyce Desilva. She is Ambassador Emeritus and former Chief Executive of Compassion in World Farming, a charity dedicated to animal welfare. Dr. Desilva speaks and publishes on the welfare of farm animals, and she played a key role in getting recognition of animal sentience enshrined in the European Union Treaty. I will now hand you over to Dr. Desilva. Please be warned that some of the photos in her presentation may be upsetting. Thank you.
Good morning, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Well, Gandhi said the greatness of a nation and its moral progress can be judged by the way its animals are treated, and you could probably insert many other words into that space where animals is, but I do think it's probably one of them. The root of all this problem, you could say, goes back to the Bible. Let man have dominion over the fish of the sea and the fowl of the air and the cattle and over all the earth. And boy, you know, have we been doing that for thousands of years? We certainly have. With little consideration, perhaps, for all those other creatures. But I think we need to see this whole question of slaughter within a kind of global context. And the figures I'm giving you are from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, FAO. So this is the predicted growth in demand for meat. And as people come out of poverty across Africa, China, and so on, the one thing they want to add to their plate is meat. And the same goes for dairy products. China's importing loads and loads of high-quality dairy cows to set up intensive dairy farms throughout China where the animals never go out at all. So looking at the global figures for slaughter, at the moment we slaughter about 70 billion farm animals every year, and that's not including fish, of course, and the figure is billions and billions more than that if you count fish. And in the UK, these are the figures for the UK, and obviously if you look at those figures, you see most of the animals who get killed are birds. They're poultry, mostly chickens. And I would say the core welfare principles about slaughter is that animals should be stunned. They should be made unconscious before their throats are cut. And that stunning, making them unconscious, should last until the animal is dead. And obviously, all animals die because their throats are cut, or, you know, unless they're shot or something. And there's a time period after the throat is cut when they could be in great pain, but that's why we stun them, so that they're unconscious for that period. And it's very important that the stun lasts until they have actually died from the loss of blood. Now, there are other methods, such as gas, which produces gradual onset of unconsciousness, and that may take a minute or two, it depends, and it's very important that the gas that's used is non-aversive. At the moment, most pigs are slaughtered with a high carbon dioxide mixture, which is actually very aversive to pigs, and Compassion in World Farming is trying to get that changed. So just to say very briefly something about the common stunning methods, most cattle, or nearly all cattle, and some sheep are killed by something called, well, stunned by something called the captive bolt. And it's a gun which fires a retractable metal thing into the brain of the front here, and the animal instantly falls down, as long as it's placed correctly. If it goes in the wrong place, you may have to do it 2 or 3 times. And then the animal is hauled up and it's cut and dies from blood loss. There's percussion stunning, which is basically a sort of knockout punch to the brain, which has a similar effect. For poultry, often they're hung up by the legs and the head is plunged into an electric water bath, which should stun them. Sometimes, of course, they lift their heads. And generally in this country, people are moving towards gas stunning of poultry. Then with sheep and pigs, and obviously pigs don't apply to the Islamic or Jewish community, but electrical tongs are put, a bit like speakers, either side of the head, and a current is sent through the brain, which knocks them out. But electrical tongs can be used attached to the brain and either the heart or the back to give a heart attack. So the animal actually is stunned and killed at the same time. And then, as I mentioned, the gas stunning of pigs and poultry, which stuns and then kills. So, you know, the whole business isn't delightful anyway. I have to say, I sometimes wonder how we can have artificial intelligence and go to the moon and haven't found a better way of killing animals for food. So you can see this cow has had the captive bolt into the brain from the front. And the slaughter regulations from the EU says that animals should be stunned before being killed, but there are exemptions. So as I say, poultry are often hung upside down. I think this is a halal slaughterhouse because it looks as if they are still alive and just about to have their throats cut. In this country, the number of sheep, etc., slaughtered is about 950 million a year. Most of those, as I said before, is poultry. Of those 950 million, 225 million slaughtered for halal and 1.3 million for kosher. None of them are stunned. Some of the halal animals are stunned. And why should we stun animals? Well, some of these sort of official bodies, the FORC is the Farm Animal Welfare Committee of the UK government. Throat cutting of an unstunned animal would result in very significant pain and distress in the period before insensibility supervenes. And EFSA is the European Food Safety Authority, says there's a high risk that animals feel extreme pain during the cutting of the throat. I know one animal welfare professor said, because sometimes people argue that actually the cut itself doesn't hurt, that even if the cut itself didn't hurt, the animal would be conscious of choking to death in its own blood. EFSA also said without stunning, the time between cutting through the major blood vessels and insensibility is up to 20 seconds in sheep, 2 minutes in cattle, or 2.5 or more minutes in poultry. So it's that the time between the cut and the actual loss of consciousness and death. That's the crucial thing, and that's why we have laws that say that animals should be stunned, so they know nothing of that. The Food Standards Agency did a survey not so long ago, and this is to do with the electrical water bath stunning of poultry, which used to be, until very recently, the way that poultry were stunned. And so they say still 25% of poultry are stunned, but of these, about 3/4 are stunned for halal. But they're using currents that aren't actually perhaps sufficient to get a proper stun, but would immobilize the animal. So the result is that many millions of poultry are being stunned for halal, but the electrical parameters they're using are not perhaps good enough to achieve an effective stun. And so we do need to do research, and that is beginning to happen, a stunning method for halal poultry from which the animals can recover, because it's very important for halal slaughter that the animal is alive when its throat is cut, not knocked out and made unconscious and then cut. So we have to have a stun from which the animal would recover if its throat wasn't cut. And so at the moment we don't have a complete answer. Probably individual stunning of birds on the head may be the answer. So let's just look what the Quran says about animals. There's not an animal on the earth nor a two-winged flying creature, but their community is like you. So, you know, Islam rates animals pretty highly. It also says the grazing livestock he has created for you, and from them you can eat. So it's not advocating vegetarianism, but it's interesting. It says grazing livestock, which perhaps does not apply to the many millions of animals who are kept in factory farms. That's something to discuss with the Muslim community. Then there was a very lovely man. We actually supported the late Mr. Masri, who had been an imam of a working mosque. He wrote a book, the latest edition of which was produced by the Islamic Foundation in Leicester with our blessing. How right is it to deny these creatures of God their natural instincts so that we may eat the end produce? And he was talking about that actually factory farming is not really compatible with Islam. And I put in this picture of this really rather distressed-looking camel because in the Hadith, which are the Islamic books about the Prophet Muhammad and his life and words, there's a really interesting story about Muhammad and his followers went to meet somebody, and outside this man's house there was a very distressed camel, probably a bit like this one. And when the owner of the camel came out of the house, it is recorded that Muhammad said, "Do you not fear God that you treat your camel like this? Because your camel has told me that you beat him and work him endlessly." And it also says that Muhammad had tears in his eyes. Now, the picture that one usually picks up of a rather sort of possibly aggressive kind of warlike leader of Muhammad seems completely opposed to this idea of a man who had tears in his eyes on seeing a camel. That's really interesting. But in Islam, food should be halal, which simply means permitted, allowed, but also tayyib, which means it should be wholesome, good, pure. And again, I would say I very much doubt that factory farmed meat or eggs from hens kept in cages could be tayyib. But there's also a record in one of the hadith, Muhammad saying, if you kill, kill well, and if you slaughter, slaughter well. Let each of you sharpen his blade and let him spare suffering to the animal he slaughters. Now, obviously, in Muhammad's day, there were no captive bowls, there were no electrical stunning devices. So I understand that prior to Islam, some animals used to actually have chunks of meat cut off their rumps and the animal left alive to sort of heal up, and then you take another bit, because without refrigeration in hot countries, how do you get fresh meat? So he was actually kind of improving the welfare of the animals that were being used for meat at that time. You could say logically, therefore, Muslims should use the highest and best welfare, best stunning methods today. In the Jewish community, there's an important principle which I'll probably incorrectly pronounce, and perhaps those of you who are Jewish could put me right, Tsar Balai Haim, which means you are prohibited from causing unnecessary pain to animals. And interestingly, someone who's already been mentioned, the former chief rabbis of the UK and Ireland, Jonathan Sachs and David Rosen, don't eat meat at all. David Rosen is actually a vegan. And the Nobel Prize-winning author, Isaac Bashevis Singer, who was convinced vegetarian, I think that's a rather lovely quote. He didn't become a vegetarian for his health, but for the health of the chickens. However, the EU regulation on the protection of animals at the time of killing, and these are the actual words of that law, so it's important that derogation from stunning animals before slaughter should be maintained, leaving a certain level of subsidiarity to each member state. So countries are allowed to make a derogation from that law. And it says, and I think this is really important if you're going to be engaging in this subject, so this regulation respects the freedom of religion, the right to manifest a religion or belief in worship, teaching, practice and observance, as enshrined in Article 10 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, which of course, if Brexit happens, may go out the door, along with much else, but never mind. As long as slaughter without pre-stunning is permitted, sometimes you can sort of meet people halfway by saying there should be post-cut stunning of cattle and sheep. And this happens in the United States, certainly with some of the Orthodox Jewish communities. They have accepted that as soon as the throat is cut, you immediately do the captive bolt and the animal becomes unconscious. So you don't save it from the pain of the cut, but you would save it from that distressing time when it's bleeding out. We also think the meat should be labelled as stunned or unstunned, so consumers can make informed choices. And also the other thing that could be done is ensuring that no more animals are slaughtered without stunning than are needed for the requirements of the religious communities. So, you know, if the Jewish community needs X number of cattle per year, that is the number of cattle that will be stunned for kosher. Just for your own information, both RSPCA Assured Meat, Red Tractor and Soil Association, they all require stun before slaughter. I can't recommend Red Tractor on any other grounds because it's not a high welfare mark at all, whereas RSPCA Assured and Soil Association, which is organic, are higher welfare. But they do all prohibit animals going into the chains unless they've been stunned. So compassionate well farming's view on religious slaughter: we don't oppose religious slaughter when animals are pre-stunned. If someone wants to say a prayer over an animal when they're killing it, that's fine by us, as long as they are going to be stunned. And we oppose all slaughter without pre-stunning, as well as poorly executed stunning. And I have to say, compassionate well farming has investigated all kinds of slaughterhouses in this country and in other parts of Europe and further afield. And even where animals are stunned, often, especially with electrical stunning, it is not being done properly, and you often see very poor treatment of the live animal before stunning. Now, many halal animals, not kosher, but halal animals are stunned before slaughter, but not always correctly, especially in the case of poultry. And this needs reform. Compassionate well farming is engaging with the Halal Food Authority, and even with its rather more fundamentalist, I wouldn't say companion organisation, because they're often at loggerheads, the Halal Monitoring Committee, which was set up a few years ago to take a slightly more harder line attitude against stunning. But the Halal Food Authority is engaging and has engaged and does seem open to trying to find a way where you can have, they can be assured that a stun is being used from which the animal could recover, even though hopefully it won't, before its throat is cut. And just to remind everyone, the Lisbon Treaty from 2008 recognises that animals are sentient beings. In other words, they can suffer. And this is supposed to apply to animals in agriculture and fisheries. I could say that there are all sorts of practices in farming and in aquaculture and in just basic fishing where this is completely disregarded. But it is actually a basis on which we can hope to make better laws in the future. If Brexit happens, the UK government, Michael Gove, has said that the UK will continue to recognise animals as sentient beings, but until that's written into some new law, we will continue to agitate him to make sure it happens. And just to say, lots of other things happen to animals which are very unfortunate. Animals are transported all over the world, farm animals. These sheep were from France. There were 2 lorry loads, one from France, one from Scotland, trucked across Europe to southeast Italy to Bari, where they were going to be shipped to Greece for slaughter and probably be served to English tourists who loved animals. They got to Bari, it was August, it was tourist time. The truck wasn't allowed to get on the boat because the tourists took up the space. And these animals were kept in their trucks over a weekend in August, by which time many on the top floor had died. And you never sort of think of sheep as panting like dogs, but the ones that were still alive were panting. There are some awful things in dairy farming. This is just a few years ago. We filmed many dairy farms around Europe. And these oversized udders, because cows have been bred to produce more and more milk, 10 times more than a calf would ever suckle from them, They're living in extreme discomfort, and these ones are actually chained as well. The chickens that we eat, and as I mentioned, most of those massive slaughter figures refer to chickens. Nearly all the chickens, apart from the backyard ones, are now kept indoors in very crowded environments, and they are slaughtered by the time they're 5 or 6 weeks old. So from tiny fluffy chick to, 2-kilogram carcass in your supermarket, the growth rate is astonishing. As a result, many of them go lame. Most of the lame ones get cut up for chicken portions, etc. They live short and very miserable lives. And just to put in a few quotes from people who I expect you've heard of, good old Voltaire, I think I'm right in saying was a convinced atheist, said how pitiful or poverty of mind to have said that animals are machines kept deprived of understanding and feeling. And I think he said this in opposition to the philosopher Descartes, who believed that animals were machines, and apparently cut up his wife's pet dog on the table in front of his friends as the animal was screaming. He said, no, it's just a mechanical reaction. Jeremy Bentham is often quoted by animal welfareists because I think this is absolutely right. The question isn't can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? And there's more and more research into the sentience and cognition of different species of farm animals. And, some of them definitely do seem to be able to reason on all sorts of things, and we're discovering more and more about their communication with each other, but they can certainly suffer. And Darwin, who was a kind of conflicted Christian, I think, said the difference in mind between man and the higher animals, he divided animals into higher and lower, great as it is, certainly is one of degree and not of kind. So he was recognizing way back then that many animals had similar capacities to ourselves. And just as we were wondering about, should we blame the Bible for all this stuff about dominion? Well, the beginning of the Bible, in Genesis 1:29, it says, I've given you every herb-bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat. So it's quite interesting that the Bible was advocating a totally plant-based vegan diet right at the beginning. Yes, so perhaps we shouldn't blame it. Okay, thank you.